The room froze. That's the only way I can describe it. Time itself seemed to pause as the crystal wine glass arced through the air in slow motion, catching the golden light of the dining room chandelier before it found its target. My daughter Sarah's face registered shock first, then the wine itself did, a deep burgundy cascade that stained her white silk blouse like blood. The sound came next, the shattering of glass against bone china, a sharp crack that split the Thanksgiving silence like lightning. My daughter gasped. My husband reached for napkins. And for one eternal second, nobody moved, as if we were all waiting for someone to explain what had just happened, as if there was a logical explanation for why Richard Thornton, successful banker, devoted grandfather, man of refined taste and calculated charm, had just hurled a glass of expensive wine across our family table with the fury of someone whose restraint had finally, catastrophically broken. I made the phone call exactly 12 minutes later. It was that decision, that single moment of action in the face of chaos, that would ultimately unravel everything we thought we knew about the Thornton family. And if you've stayed with me this far, if you're wondering what happens next, comment "wine and secrets" below. I want to know if you would have made that call. But to explain why I called who I called, and what that conversation revealed, I need to take you back to where this story truly began, not on Thanksgiving night, but years earlier, in a moment that nobody at that table was prepared to acknowledge, much less confront. Sarah was 26 when she married James Thornton, and she was happy, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way that made my husband and me feel that old parental relief, the sense that our daughter had found someone who would build a good life with her. James was thoughtful, ambitious, and kind. He worked in commercial real estate, had the kind of steady demeanor that suggests a man comfortable with himself. His family seemed equally solid. His mother, Patricia, was warm and gracious. His younger sister, Michelle, was vibrant and welcoming. And his father, Richard Thornton, was the kind of man people described as distinguished. Tall, silver-haired, with an almost aristocratic bearing that suggested old money and older traditions. He was successful in finance, well-connected, the sort of person who dominated conversations not through volume, but through the sheer gravitational pull of his presence. When he smiled, it was carefully calibrated. When he listened, you felt seen. When he spoke, people leaned in. What I didn't know then, what I suspect James didn't fully know either, was that Richard Thornton's charm was a performance perfected over decades, a carefully constructed facade designed to hide something far uglier beneath. It's easy to miss these things when you're not looking for them, when you want to believe that your daughter's happiness is genuine and uncomplicated.
We see what we want to see.
The first real gathering after Sarah and James's wedding was Easter dinner, about 3 months into the marriage. It seemed like an innocent enough occasion, nothing that should have raised red flags. But I remember one moment that stuck with me, though I didn't know why at the time. We were all in the living room after dinner, having coffee and dessert. Sarah had made a comment, something innocuous about a vacation she and James were planning, and Richard responded with a remark that was ostensibly joking but carried an edge underneath. He said something like, "Well, I hope James knows what he's getting into." That's the thing about choosing a wife. You're stuck with her forever, for better or worse. He laughed when he said it, but his eyes were hard. James had immediately interjected with a comment about how excited he was, but there was tension in his voice, the kind you hear when someone is trying to smooth over something jagged. I mentioned it to my husband afterward, and he dismissed it. "That's just how he is," he said. "Some men of his generation talk like that. It doesn't mean anything." But it meant something. I just didn't understand what yet. Over the next few years, there were other moments. A Thanksgiving dinner where Richard made a cutting remark about Sarah's career choices. She's an elementary school teacher, suggesting that it was a shame to waste her potential on what he called simple work. A Christmas where he publicly undermined James's business judgment regarding a project, doing it in front of several of their friends in a way that made James's jaw clench and his eyes go distant. A birthday celebration where Richard drank too much and became what I can only describe as emotionally aggressive, picking at family members with comments designed to sting, cloaked in the language of just telling the truth and not being politically correct. There was also his relationship with James's mother, Patricia. She was always somehow slightly apologetic around him, diminished. She would laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny, would defer to his opinions even on subjects where she clearly had valid thoughts. I watched her do it so many times that it became almost invisible, the way a woman learns to fold herself smaller to accommodate a man's larger presence. But it was there. That diminishment, that learned deference. The kind you don't unlearn, even after decades. And then there were the incidents that James never quite explained, but that I pieced together through overheard conversations and my husband's gossip sessions with Patricia. There was a story about Richard's first marriage, James's mother from his early life. She had left him when James was 7. I remember Patricia mentioning, in carefully measured tones, that Richard's emotional intensity had made things difficult, that he had certain expectations about how a wife should behave, that he had specific ideas about respect and obedience that perhaps were more old-fashioned than some women could accept. She said this while pouring me coffee, her hands steady, her face practiced in neutrality. There were also stories, whispered between James and Sarah when they thought nobody could hear, about an incident in Richard's office years ago. A secretary who had filed a complaint about his behavior. Money had changed hands. The complaint had been withdrawn. Nobody talked about it directly, but it floated in the family mythology like an unspoken understanding. Richard Thornton was the kind of man who could make problems disappear. But Sarah was happy with James, or so I believed. They had a good marriage. They planned to have children. They seemed to navigate James's family dynamics with a kind of practiced caution that suggested they had learned to avoid certain topics and situations. Sarah would change the subject quickly if Richard made one of his characteristic jabs. James would excuse himself from the room when his father's mood began to shift towards something dangerous. These were coping mechanisms, small survival strategies that families develop when one member is volatile. What I didn't realize was how much pressure was building underneath all of that avoidance, and more importantly, what I wasn't seeing, because I wasn't looking hard enough. As a mother, I prided myself on being perceptive, on noticing the things that others missed. But with Richard, I had made a choice, conscious or unconscious. I'm still not entirely sure, to not see,
To not name what was happening.
to protect the fiction of a normal family gathering rather than acknowledge the dysfunction that was festering beneath the surface. I wonder sometimes if he could sense that willingness in me, that reluctance to confront. If he knew that I would be among the easiest to manage, the quickest to look away. Thanksgiving morning of that year, Sarah called me. This was unusual. My daughter and I were close, but we didn't typically speak by phone unless something was wrong. Her voice sounded strained, careful, like she was speaking in a way designed not to be overheard. She asked if she and James could come by early, before dinner. I agreed without asking questions, though I sensed something was shifting. When they arrived about an hour later, I could see that something was deeply wrong. Sarah looked tired, and there was a kind of emotional brittleness to her that I recognized because I had seen it in myself at certain points in my own life. The look of someone carrying something unbearable. James looked worse, older than his 32 years, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something emotionally heavy for too long. They and I sat in my living room. I remember this detail because I deliberately moved us away from where my husband was working, wanted a space where Sarah could speak freely without the self-consciousness that comes from being overheard. Sarah told me that James's father had called him the night before, drunk, and had said some terrible things. The details were private, but the gist was clear. Richard had made accusations about Sarah, had suggested that James was weak for allowing his wife to have her own opinions, and had indicated that Thanksgiving dinner was going to be a moment of recalibration. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I think I already knew. "We don't know," Sarah said, and there was fear in her voice. Actual fear. "But when he uses that word, recalibration, it usually means he's going to do something designed to remind us all who's in control." That's when I should have told them to cancel. That's when I should have said that Richard was not welcome at my table, that no man who spoke to my daughter with that level of contempt deserved the privilege of sitting at her Thanksgiving dinner. But I didn't. I was uncomfortable with the idea of family conflict made visible, of taking sides, of making it all real and discussable. I told Sarah that it would probably be fine, that Richard was likely just drunk and wouldn't remember half of what he'd said. I told her to stay strong. I told her to enjoy her husband. All the things that women tell other women when we're too frightened to acknowledge that someone among us is fundamentally dangerous. All the ways we minimize and normalize and protect the peace at the expense of actual safety. Looking back, I can see exactly how I failed her in that moment. I can see the moment when she needed me to be a fortress, and I was instead a mirror, reflecting back her own uncertainty, her own desire to believe that things would be okay. I can see the moment when she needed me to say, absolutely not, and instead I said, probably fine. And I have had to sit with that failure, had to understand it, had to forgive myself for it while also holding myself accountable for it. By 7 o'clock that evening, the dining room was full. My husband, Sarah, James's mother Patricia, his sister Michelle, and her husband Todd and Richard. There was an abundance of food, the kind of spread that takes days to prepare. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, 3 kinds of potatoes, vegetables glazed and caramelized to perfection. Wine was flowing. Conversation was light, deliberately so. I could feel everyone performing normalcy, pretending that James's morning visit to us had never happened, that Richard hadn't called with threats disguised as concerns, that we were just a happy, functional family gathering for a holiday meal. Richard was in a generous mood. That was the dangerous part. He was complimentary, charming, the best version of himself. He praised Sarah's dress. He complimented Michelle on her new job. He told Patricia she looked beautiful. It was the kind of performance that feels safe until it doesn't, until you realize that the cheerfulness is a stage being set, that the kindness is a weapon being sharpened. We were about halfway through dinner when Michelle made an offhand comment about a decision that Richard had made regarding family finances, something about a trust or an investment that had been handled in a way she questioned. It was a small comment, not aggressive, just a mild wondering aloud about a business decision. But I watched Richard's expression shift. The smile didn't fade, but everything behind it changed. His eyes became glittery, dangerous. He set down his fork with meticulous care. "So, you don't think I handle the family money well?" he asked Michelle, his voice perfectly pleasant. "I didn't say that," Michelle began, already retreating. "Because from where I sit, this family has done extraordinarily well because of decisions I've made," Richard continued, still smiling that terrible smile. "Some of you seem to have very short memories about what I've provided." Patricia made a small sound, a kind of deflecting laugh, and quickly tried to change the subject. But Richard held up his hand. He was just getting started. "Actually, you know what?" he said, turning to James. "I was thinking about that phone call we had last night, about how I expressed my concerns about certain decisions you've made. And I realize I wasn't clear enough. I want everyone here to understand what I see when I look at what's happening in your marriage." James's face went pale. I could see him calculating, trying to find a way to de-escalate, to prevent what was coming. "James is a capable young man," Richard said, turning to address the table as if James wasn't there. but he's allowed himself to be influenced by weak decisions. He's let his wife make choices that affect his career trajectory, his family status. He's lost his authority in his own marriage. And that weakness, that lack of backbone, that comes from somewhere. And I think I know where. He looked at Patricia when he said this, and I watched her flinch as if he'd physically struck her. "Richard, please," she whispered. "No," he said, his voice hardening. "I think it's time we all acknowledged what's actually happening in this family. I think it's time people understood that some of us work very hard to maintain things, and some of us just benefit from it without respect or gratitude." Sarah had set down her fork. Her hands were trembling slightly. I could see this from where I sat across from her. She looked at James, and I saw the moment she made a decision, the moment she decided that this performance had gone on long enough. "Richard," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "maybe you've had enough wine." That was it. That was the moment he chose to explode. He stood up from the table so suddenly that his chair scraped backward with a sound like an animal's cry. He looked at Sarah with pure hatred, the kind of hatred that doesn't make sense unless there's something deeper underneath it, something about what she represents that threatens him in a way he can't articulate. "You don't speak to me that way," he said. "You don't correct me. You don't." And then he grabbed his wine glass. It happened so fast that for a second I thought he was going to drink from it, to make a dismissive gesture.
But no.
He drew his arm back, and he threw it. The glass was full, and it flew through the air like a projectile, like something designed to hurt, and it caught Sarah directly in the face and neck. Wine exploded across her, across the table, across the white linen and the fine china and all the careful decorations of a normal family meal. For a moment, nobody did anything. Sarah sat there, stunned, wine dripping from her hair, her dress ruined, a small cut appearing on her neck where the rim of the glass had caught her. And in that moment of silence, I felt something shift inside me, something break open. Something moved from theoretical concern to actual rage. In that instant, I knew. This was the moment. This was when I had to choose whose side I was on. And I chose hers. My husband made a sound of shock. Michelle started crying. Todd stood up, his face darkening with anger. James was frozen, his expression somewhere between disbelief and recognition, as if he was finally seeing his father clearly, seeing what he'd always known but had spent his entire life denying. Richard stared at his daughter-in-law, and for a moment I thought he might say something, might try to justify himself or dismiss what he'd just done. But instead, he left the room. He simply walked out, leaving the wreckage behind like he'd done it 100 times before, like there were no consequences for the things he did, like we would all simply clean up and move on. It was then that I excused myself and made the phone call. I went into my home office, closed the door, and dialed a number I'd been given years ago, back when I'd first started noticing the patterns in Richard's behavior. I had told myself I would never need to use it. I was wrong. The person I called was a private investigator named David Chun, someone who had done some work for my company years earlier. But more importantly, as I would soon discover, David had also done some very specific work for Patricia Thornton over the past several years. When David answered my call, I didn't bother with preamble. I simply told him that what had just happened at my dinner table was the breaking point, and that I was authorizing him to share everything he'd been documenting with James and with Patricia. I told him the truth needed to come out, that I was done protecting Richard Thornton or anyone else from the consequences of his actions. What David had been documenting, it turned out, was a pattern of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and what amounted to coercive control that had been shaping the Thornton family for decades. Richard hadn't just been emotionally abusive. He had systematically isolated family members financially, controlling access to money, using financial leverage to maintain compliance, threatening to cut people off if they didn't behave in ways he approved of. There were records of suspicious transactions, of funds moved without full disclosure, of Patricia's own inheritance being channeled in ways that gave Richard control over it. There were patterns of behavior that became visible only when viewed together, a mosaic of control that had been so normalized that nobody had recognized it for what it was. The secretary from all those years ago had indeed filed a complaint. But the complaint hadn't been about minor sexual harassment. It had been about sustained psychological abuse, and what the complaint form had labeled coercive work practices designed to control and diminish the employee's autonomy. There was also a lawsuit mentioned, one that had been settled under confidentiality terms, which meant there were probably other women who had experienced something similar. And there was something else. Something that Patricia had discovered a year earlier and had been investigating with David's help. Richard had been maintaining what amounted to a double life, with a woman in the city, an arrangement that had been ongoing for at least a decade. This wasn't about infidelity in the conventional sense. It was about another layer of deception, another way in which he had been living underneath a false facade while demanding perfection and loyalty from everyone around him. When Patricia received the documentation that David shared, which she did the day after Thanksgiving, after James had called her and told her what I'd done, she finally made the decision she'd been contemplating for years. She filed for divorce. She went to a lawyer, a woman specialist in family law who understood financial abuse, who understood how to extract Patricia from a situation where her assets had been so deeply entangled with Richard's control systems that untangling them would require both legal expertise and genuine courage. She also understood that leaving a man like Richard required not just legal protection but emotional support, and she connected Patricia with a therapist who specialized in coercive control. The divorce that followed was not amicable. It was contentious and revealing and ugly in the ways that divorces become when they finally name the truth that's been hiding inside a marriage for decades. Property was disputed. Patricia's own money was traced and recovered. Richard's affair was documented and presented as evidence of the deliberate deception that had characterized their relationship. And slowly, through depositions and legal filings and expert testimony, the family's actual dynamics became visible in a way they never had been before. James was devastated, discovering that his father was not just emotionally abusive but systematically controlling, discovering that his mother had been trapped in a situation that she couldn't easily escape, discovering that the wealth and stability he'd always associated with his father had been built partially on financial manipulation of his own mother. These realizations broke something in him. But they also broke something open. He entered therapy. He began having difficult conversations with Sarah about the ways his family's dysfunction had shaped his own behavior, his own conflicts, his own relationship patterns. He had to confront the ways he had learned to be complicit in his father's abuse, the ways he had enabled it through silence and accommodation. Michelle was angry, first at her father, then at her mother for not having left sooner, then at herself for not having seen sooner, then at the family system that had allowed this to continue for so long. She eventually came to understand that anger was a luxury, that her mother had been doing her best to survive an impossible situation, and that her father's behavior was the problem, not the solution or her mother's response to it. And Sarah? Sarah was forced to make a decision about whether she wanted Richard Thornton in her life at all. She chose to set a boundary. No contact unless and until he engaged in meaningful therapy and genuine accountability. He never did. Over the years, she would hear through James that Richard had remarried. The woman from the city, the one he'd been maintaining a parallel relationship with, and had essentially restarted his life with a new family, applying the same patterns he'd applied to his first one. Some people don't change. Some people just move to a new table to set up the same game. What my phone call to David had initiated was a cascade of revelation, A moment when the family decided that preserving the fiction of stability was no longer more important than acknowledging the truth. It wasn't a solution. Family trauma doesn't work that way. It doesn't have neat conclusions. But it was a beginning. It was the moment when the family chose to stop pretending, to stop protecting a man who had spent decades protecting himself at the expense of everyone around him. Looking back on that Thanksgiving, I think about the wine glass constantly. I think about that moment when it flew through the air, that frozen second where everything was possible, where I could choose what story I wanted to tell about this family, what narrative I wanted to uphold. I could have dismissed it as an isolated incident. I could have protected Richard's reputation, urged everyone to move on, suggested that Sarah had provoked him. I could have done what families do when they encounter unbearable truths. I could have buried it. Instead, I made a phone call. And that call changed everything, not because it solved anything, but because it named what had been unnamed for so long, because it made visible what had been hiding in the space between what families say and what families actually are. It forced us all to stop performing normalcy and start acknowledging reality. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop protecting people who don't deserve protection. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is tell the truth, especially when it hurts. That Thanksgiving dinner taught me that staying silent in the face of abuse is its own form of violence. Every time I said nothing, every time I told myself that Richard was just how he was, every time I prioritized his comfort over my daughter's safety, I was choosing his story over hers. I was complicit. I will never know if that phone call was the right decision. I will never know if there was a better way to handle it, a path that would have led to genuine healing rather than just exposure. But I know that silence would have continued the cycle, and I know that finally, after years of looking away, I chose to see. And sometimes, seeing is the only revolutionary act available to us. It's the moment before action, the space where accountability begins, the point at which we stop being bystanders and start being witnesses to the truth. So here's what I want to ask you. If you were at that table, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have made the call? Drop your answer in the comments, because I think your response matters. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and speaking truth, share this. Because there are other mothers out there, other women who are watching their daughters get hurt and trying to figure out when silence becomes complicity. They need to know they're not alone. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, because some of the darkest truths hide closest to home, and sometimes they need to be brought into the light.